Good morning and welcome to this All Energy Decarbonised webinar, the 7th in our monthly series. I'm Judith Patton, All Energy's Project Director and its co-creator 20 years ago. Thank you for being with us. We're thrilled at the response we've had to our webinars. As you sit in the virtual audience, you're one of around 550 people who've registered for the speed and the scale. It's a topic about which Matthew Knight first spoke to me many months ago, and which was due to be included in our live event in May. He's gathered together a stellar panel, all of whom, in his words, get it. A very warm welcome to you too, panelists. Matthew's not the only one urging action. In yesterday's webinar on the resurgence of onshore wind, there was talk of going further, faster and better. And in today's Guardian, the executive director of the International Energy Agency is telling the world it has only 6 months in which to change the course of the climate crisis and prevent a post-lockdown rebound in greenhouse gases. But I'm here to cover the housekeeping items. I'll leave inspiring you to grasp the speed and scale nettle to Matthew and his panel. In the virtual world, I don't have to talk of switching phones off or fire alarms, but what I do have to tell you is that if you want to take part in polls, indeed the first one is now open, and are watching in full screen, you'll need to shrink it to see the poll, and indeed to ask questions. All our webinars are available on demand, so you can enjoy this one and others over and over again. That's the housekeeping done. It's over to you, Matthew, and your fellow luminaries to get the speed and scale show on the road.
Well, thank you, Judith, and good morning, everyone. I'm Matthew Knight, Head of Business Development for Siemens Energy in the UK, and I'm speaking to you from my garden shed at home in the New Forest. Our subject today is speed and scale. What's really required to meet the huge challenge of climate change. Now, humans are not wired for understanding big numbers. Our brains tend to think that 1 million is a big number and 1 billion is a bit bigger. But it's important that we operate at the right scale when we're thinking about responding to climate. For example, 1 million seconds is the middle of next week, and 1 billion seconds is February 2052. So we need to think at the right scale for our response. Net zero leaves no place to hide. We need to replace the entire world's energy system of today with something twice the size, greenhouse gas free, during the next 30 years. And that demands a huge response from technology, from politics, from customers, from the way people choose, make choices about their lifestyle and the way they use energy. It means displacing incumbents and growing whole new industries against the clock in less than 1 billion seconds. We're going to talk about energy today, and energy is power, heat and transport. And we need to decarbonise all three and recognise that they're interrelated. So we have a fantastic panel, each of whom is a champion for change in their own sector. So let's meet them. Delivering net zero is going to require some big changes, and we've all experienced a few changes over the last few months. So as the panel introduce themselves, you in the audience have the opportunity to tell us about your lockdown experience. But I'd like to turn first to Julia. Where are you locked down, and what's been the most significant change for you personally over the last 3 months?
In Cambridge, and in the challenges of an open plan house. So you may see my husband, who is also locked down here, scuttle behind me to the urgent task of making himself more coffee. What's been the biggest change? People have had some terrible desire to have meetings, and the most frustrating thing for me has been that my diary has filled entirely with Zoom meetings, leaving no thinking time. And somehow I think we need a better lockdown etiquette to get over this.
Thank you. And Charlotte, where are you locked down and what's changed for you?
Hi everyone, I'm Charlotte Owen from the Association for Decentralised Energy. I'm locked down in Wapping in East London, which is beautifully located just by the River Thames. So have been able to make good use of those riverside walks when it's been sunny. But I think the biggest challenge for me has been not having a good separation between my work life and my home life. I think for many of us in the low carbon sector, you know, we feel very passionate about what we're doing, and it's quite difficult sometimes to switch off and to actually you know, go and have a space to relax, and particularly when your office is, you know, 5 feet from your bedroom, that can make it quite a difficult challenge to actually find the time to decompress.
It's a mixed experience for all of us. So Graeme, what's your lockdown situation?
Hi, good morning to you all. Thank you, Matthew. My lockdown situation, so I live in rural Berkshire. National Grid's control room is about 6 minutes that way. I live in a carbon neutral house, or effectively carbon neutral house. So you know, it's a listed building. It's got heat pumps. I have an EV. I even treat all my own wastewater. So I'm a very low impact building. Somebody described to me the other day that if Carling did lockdown, that's what I've got. So I live rurally. I'm incredibly lucky. I have a reasonable sized garden. I live in the countryside, and actually what lockdown has done for me is made me more productive. I've gained almost 3 hours a day, which was either commuting into London, commuting into Palace of Westminster, commuting up to Warwick. So I've been trying to put that time to productive use. So I've been running 10 miles every other day, and my wife has given me a very comprehensive list of jobs to do in the garden. So my garden's never looked better. I appreciate not everybody has the same experience of lockdown, but I've been very lucky.
Well, thanks, Graeme. It's interesting to see from the poll result that about 9% of people agree with you, but it's good to see that very few, if any, have had a terrible lockdown experience. So we're talking about making big changes to really everything in our economy. And if I can turn to Julia, one of your roles is as Vice Chair of the Committee on Climate Change, the body that advises government on net zero and also holds them to account. And that must be a great position to see the huge scale and breadth of the challenge of responding to climate change. Please will you share some of that with us and give us a sense of the speed with which we need to respond?
Thank you, Matthew. Yes, so if somebody can share my slides for me, I'll get going. That's great. Well, as Matthew said, I'm the Vice Chair of the Committee on Climate Change, and I want to just take you through the some of the change that's implicit in our net zero report that we produced last year, which was the report which the government based its decision to put into legislation, the net zero target. But while I'm talking to you about that, I also want to set a poll for you. And interestingly, Matthew's mentioned that he has been through the process of getting a zero carbon home and putting in heat pumps. So I want to ask you about heat pumps. And so while I'm talking, I hope you'll tell me about your thoughts about installing zero carbon heat and particularly heat pumps. So I've got a very small number of slides, so let me move to the next slide. This is the level of change that is implicit in the work we did on the Committee on Climate Change for the net zero report. So behind our scenarios for getting to net zero, so it's very positive, the report says this is something we can do, but behind those scenarios, as we've been hinting at, are some very big changes. And depending on the scenario, in the UK, we need to increase between now and 2050, increase our electricity system by a factor of 2 to 4. So our core scenario, our electricity system is about double the size by 2050. That's of course because we're using a lot more electricity in our homes, a lot more electricity for transport, and a lot more electricity supporting industry. So a much bigger electricity system. Underpinning that electricity system is a huge growth in renewables, and indeed almost an order of magnitude probably growth in the amount of offshore wind. So we've got around just under 10 gigawatts operating today. By 2050 that needs to be something like 75 to 100 gigawatts. So an order of magnitude scaling of that industry. We've got to create from nothing a hydrogen industry and create a hydrogen industry which generates as much energy as roughly as our electricity system does today. We've got to get carbon capture and storage going for industry, for some of that hydrogen, and that's a huge industry. Again, we have nothing today. That needs to be in place and operating by 2050. We've got to upscale our afforestation to absorb CO2 from the atmosphere. We do about 10,000 hectares per year at the moment. We probably need to be closer to 50,000. We've got some more than 30 million buildings, 28 or 29 million homes, which need to be changed over to low carbon heat. So 1 million buildings a year being changed over to low carbon heat. We've got about 250,000 electric cars on our roads. We've got to change the entire car fleet. That's kind of over 30 million to zero carbon vehicles by 2050. In order to plant all those trees and to grow some more bioenergy crops, we're going to need some really significant landscape change. So probably changing the use of something like 20% of our agricultural land. That's a really major transformation. And to support that, people are going to have to change their diets. So we're going to need to see significantly less meat and dairy consumption in order to free up that land for the tree planting and the other crops that we may need. Now, over 30 years, historically, we've done more than one of those things at the same time, but we've never done all of that lot at the same time. And if we're going to achieve this in 30 years, it is urgent that we get going now. Can I have the next slide, please? Some of those things can be done without us really needing to engage very much. If the funding is there, industry can become zero carbon, we can put more, we can have more offshore wind, we can have other renewable technologies, we can get carbon capture and storage going. There's nothing kind of very emotional for us about that. We don't have to really engage with that other than recognizing that we will have to support the financial mechanisms that will help it to happen. But the rest of that change, so about 62% of the change we need to see, we do have to engage with. A small amount is a change that we need to make. So that's capturing some of the habits we've had in lockdown. So things like doing more working from home and flying less, and perhaps changing our diets. May not have done that in lockdown. So some of that, 9%, is stuff that we have to do as people and doesn't need any technology. But more than half of that change actually involves us making different decisions. And that's why I asked you about fuel, about whether you've been thinking about heat pumps, because actually that's the kind of different decision we're going to need to make in order to achieve net zero. So we're going to have to buy different kinds of cars. We're going to have our homes much better insulated and installing heat pumps. And I'm interested to see that the results of your poll have come just in time, and you're split about 50-50. I've got 49%. No, I've got 50% of you who think the disruption would put you off, or if I have a boiler failure, I won't have time to think about it, or I don't think they're effective. So half of you are in the still quite difficult to persuade category perhaps, and half of you are already in the I've done it or I'm thinking about it category. So that's just a measure in an audience, a really committed audience like this. I've only got half of you engaged with this agenda of the transformation we need in those 30+ million buildings we have in the UK. So there is an enormous amount to do, and more than half of it involves us actively making different decisions. So can I have my final slide, please? Let me just leave you with a lovely quote from Greta Thunberg. It's very easy to think, to say, oh, we can't start now because we've still got to do lots more planning. We have to start now. The next 10 years are critical. You'd never have built Salisbury Cathedral if you were worried about what was going to happen on the top of the spire. Thank you very much.
Can I? Thank you, Julia. That was a very clear description of the scale of the challenge that we have. And I think important that you brought out that we shouldn't be daunted by it, but we need to resolve to rise to the challenge. Now, one of the largest parts of that challenge for the UK is going to be decarbonising heat. It's the area with the least progress so far. And when it comes to heating our homes, it could be the one with the greatest personal impact. Charlotte, as policy manager at the ADE, this is an issue that you grapple with all the time. Please, can you introduce the subject of heat decarbonisation for us and give us a sense of the scale of the task there?
Sure, I can indeed. So hopefully you should all be able to see my slides. If we could just make them live. Brilliant, thanks. So yes, hi everyone. So just a reminder, I'm Charlotte from the ADE. I'm going to be talking to you today about zoning. So this is breaking down the challenge and getting moving on heat and energy efficiency. So just quickly, for those of you who don't know, the ADE is a trade association representing more than 160 organisations. Some of them are there on the screen, and we work on heat, but most specifically focus on heat networks. So what do all of these things have in common? So you've got Bigfoot, you've got Flat Earth, you've got Icarus, and you've got the silver bullet. And these are all myths. And I think it's easy to understand why this myth of the silver bullet for decarbonising heating is such an attractive narrative when you think about the scale of the challenge. That's 29 million homes that we need to decarbonise between now and 2050. And that's not even including non-domestic buildings as well. But heat is inherently local, and different areas of the UK will have different pathways for decarbonisation. This is because, you know, there are different levels of energy efficiency in different areas of the country. There's different building fabrics. Different areas have access to geothermal or waste heat. Some areas need higher temperatures, so for example, if they're in an industrial area. And I think another key thing to note is that different areas of the UK will be able to decarbonise at different rates and to different targets. So some areas will be able to go further. And I think some areas already have a clear decarbonisation pathway. You know, look at some local councils like Bristol that are pursuing heat networks, for example. And we must enable those areas that can move early to do so. But at the moment, I think there's a bit of a hesitancy for local areas that do have clear pathways to begin moving now. And I think that really comes down to the fact that we are still receiving these very mixed and confusing messages from government about this potential of a single technology or single fuel pathway, when actually there are lots of different routes for different areas to reach net zero. So why don't local authority move already? And it really comes down to this risk question. So as a local authority and picking a local pathway, you are essentially you know, creating an investment. You are investing in resources from within your local authority. You are using taxpayers' money to do so. You are investing in local skills. You're undertaking that mapping process. And if down the road, national government policy actually locks out the decisions that you've taken, for example, by pursuing a single technology pathway when actually you've opted for heat networks, that obviously presents a big risk. And we obviously know there are already challenges around local authority funding as well. So this is why the AD advocates for something called zoning. So this is the idea that you would take a view of a local area. You would think about what the opportunities are in that area in terms of waste heat, in terms of geothermal. Are there constraints on the electricity grid that will require costly network reinforcement? What is the local transport strategy? And you would think about what the most appropriate pathways are in consultation with DNOs, with GDNs, with your local area, with the neighbouring local authority, for example. example, to identify what the most appropriate solution would be. And in zoning an area, so in saying we think this area is most suited to a heat pump or heat network or hydrogen, you would make that area benefit from policies that are specifically designed to encourage that technology to come forward in that area. And what this does is it creates this really interesting way that we can start to engage with consumers. It moves you from this distress situation where you think, oh goodness, my boiler has broken down, what do? I best replace it, I best install the default situation, to one where you actually have this planned in-home transition. You've been thinking about what you're going to do when your boiler breaks down, or perhaps you're thinking about phasing it out early. You've been improving the energy efficiency of your home, ready for that low carbon heating solution. And your local authority and national government are actually able to support you to enact that plan. You're aware of what your local pathways are, and as is your local workforce, and they are specifically tailored to deliver what you need. So they are aware that perhaps your local pathway is to connect to a heat network or is to deploy hydrogen, and they can advise you on how to do that. So I think for us, zoning achieves several things. So other than just enabling us to get started on this enormous challenge and enabling those that can move early to do so, it also creates clear pipelines for investment by saying we expect this technology to come forward in this particular area. It creates a framework for consumer engagement by providing an opportunity for consumers to get involved in the conversation around what their local heat decarbonisation pathway looks like and what it will mean for them, which will create greater levels of consumer acceptance and awareness. And finally, it allows us to target that government support, so to target funding in a way that delivers strategic benefits for the wider system. For example, thinking about how deployment of certain funding can actually support a smarter system, for example, by enabling flexibility. And it really allows us to think about the way that we are spending government money and resources in a way that is sensible. So some of the asks, and I should say this is just some of them, are things like we want to see a specific team and deputy director or head in government responsible for retrofit policy. This currently doesn't seem to exist. There's no one who seems to have this overall remit for retrofit policy, and that is the big question, the retro gap. We want to see a rigorous consumer engagement and awareness campaign begin. We want to acknowledge that there is no single technology or fuel pathway to net zero, which will enable local areas that can move now to do so. And we ask government to consider zoning as part of the heat and building strategy on the heat decarbonisation roadmap. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Charlotte. So what came out for me in what you said was that not only do we need people to be motivated to do stuff, we need to take away some of the barriers to them being able to do that.
Indeed.
Heat is clearly a big challenge. We'll turn to Graeme Cooper, who's going to talk about transport, because transport, surely that's going to be easy. Our audience just need to buy a bunch of electric cars and then we're all sorted. Isn't that true, Graeme?
Well, if only it were that simple, but actually it's probably the easiest thing for us to do. I mean, if you think about the pathway decisions, but anyway, let's frame this a little bit. I just need to, for the purpose of the audience, national grid often means different things to different people. So I just need to clarify where I sit within our organisation. So National Grid owns the electricity transmission system in England and Wales. National Grid owns the gas transmission in England, Wales and Scotland. A separate part of National Grid also is the electricity system operator who manages the real-time supply and demand. So I don't work for the bit that does real-time supply and demand, that's the system operator. So I'm about pipes and wires. But being about pipes and wires, that means we're technology agnostic. I see a lot of work in this space where people are sort of very tribal about the technology. It's either electricity or it's hydrogen. And then there's the debate rages between the two. But the nice thing from a National Grid perspective is our license makes us technology agnostic. We're not allowed to pick winners. We have to treat every connectee the same. But let me just give you a bit of a frame and scale here, bearing in mind the environment we're talking about. So the dirtiest thing we did up until about 2016, 2017 was make power, burning stuff for the purposes of electricity. What happened in 2016 into 2017 is transport became the dirtiest thing we do. Now that's not because transport got particularly dirty, it's because the energy system over the last 15 years has got so very much cleaner. So it shows you in a period of about 15 years how much we could change. I mean, I'll give you real world experience. Before I joined National Grid, I spent 11 years building wind farms. Now, when I first started out in wind farming, the broad perception of the energy industry was the grid would fall over if we had more than 5% renewables on the system. So in the last few weeks and months, we've done a huge amount of time without coal and with massive percentage of renewable penetration there. So what we need to do is to be open to the ability to change. So when we move into 2018, 2019, what we see is the dirtiest thing we do as a country is move people and goods. So 28% of our emissions are through transport, which actually means transport is the lowest hanging fruit. But back to Matthew's point, it's also the one that can move fastest. So if we think about it, a typical power station is there for 40 years. Typical wind farm is going to be there for 25, 30 years. But personal cars, if you're lucky enough to have a company car, you'll change every 3 or 4 years. If you buy a private car, you'll change it roughly every 7. But that means that cars in the UK have an average life of 13.7 years, which means if your next car is not clean, I'd have a pretty good guess that the one after it is likely to be. But this is not just about cars, because when we think about charging cars, that's generally happening in the distribution level, unless, of course, that's high power en route charging. Next time you drive the motorway, and no, not of us are not doing a lot of driving right now, but the next time you drive the motorway, just count pylons. You run out of fingers really, really quickly. There's a natural synergy between transit corridors for roads and the corridors that pylon runs run along. So there is that symbiotic relationship. The National Grid's responsibility here is not about sort of just picking cars. We're here to be the enabler of this transition to net zero, which means my responsibility being the project director of the Transport Decarbonisation is not limited to cars and vans. My responsibility covers road, rail, aviation and maritime. Now, admittedly, road travel is singularly the largest one there. But we, as Julie pointed out, we need to do everything. This is not about picking the easy ones and leaving leaving the difficult to do. So what we've got, I guess, coming up is up until now we've seen OLEV flag that we need between at least 50, but could be as much as 70% of all new car sales need to be zero emissions by, hang on, let me get this right, by 2035, right? But when we look at that, we realise that actually there could be some natural changes anyway, but we're also consulting in the meantime about, the government's consulting already about banning the sale of combustion engine vehicles earlier. So they're talking about 2035 or sooner. It's 2032 in Scotland. They're thinking about including hybrid vehicles in that. So there's an awful lot to do in that space. But let's not, as I say, let's not also get tribal about this. Now, when we're looking at the lens of light vehicles and vans, yes, electricity, battery electric vehicles kind of are the pioneering and where it's going at scale. But when we look at the journey to net zero, when the commitment was 80% reduction by 2050, you could probably do most of that with electricity alone. But by taking that to 100%, really and truly, you are in the spot where you need hydrogen there. Now, Matthew, I'm sure, will talk about this in a little bit. Hydrogen, most of the hydrogen on the road in the system today is made through dirty sources. So it's not actually some sort of panacea, but there are lots of options to make that cleaner. But there will be some very distinctive uses for alternative fuels, synthetic fuels, and hydrogen in some of the more difficult to fix stuff, like aviation, like maritime, even things like heavy goods on the railways. So we need to be open to all options. It isn't and shouldn't be tribal. I guess the thing that also then leads me to in my sort of final points are lots of people talk about clever technology solutions, the vehicles, the charging solution, the apps, how this is all going to be seamless. People forget the underlying infrastructure that makes all of that possible. So up until now, networks have been reactionary. We react to a connectee. What we really need is actually some, and this comes back to Julia's comment and Greta Thunberg. We need to start looking at anticipatory investment to make sure the right capacity is in the right grid capacity, in the right location at the right time. So we need to collectively agree on sort of the least regrets. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. But one final point, I think we also need to understand that this needs to be a just transition. Okay, this needs to be a transition that works for everybody and doesn't leave anyone behind. You know, the way we look at it right now is all of the changes to the electricity system fall on bill payers. We will need to have a conversation with Ofgem, and Ofgem is starting to think about this, is how do they regulate for net zero as part of their work plans? So I think we will see an evolution in the way the regulator regulates. That will have an impact on the way networks serve. And so finally, if the transition to decarbonising heat and transport goes really, really well, nobody is going to thank the energy networks. However, if this transition doesn't go well, it would be very easy to point the finger at the energy networks. And this is not transmission versus distribution, it's energy networks. People in transport and heat don't actually really care who owns the wires. So anyway, I'll leave you there. This is a big challenge, and what we need to be doing is getting there at speed. Okay, because this is only get more and more difficult the closer we get to net zero in 2050. Over to you, Matthew.
Thank you, Graeme. So mobility is not just cars, it's trains, planes, ships, and all the rest of it.
Absolutely. And actually the first thing, Matthew, is we need to do less. I mean, the first thing in any of these scenarios, when it's heat, we need to make better thermally performance buildings. If it's transport, the first step is do less. It shouldn't be just about swapping hydrocarbons for electrons. We need to just think about the whole piece. Anyway, sorry, over to you.
Well, that's good. Noting that a lot of people are having a fairly good lockdown so far from the poll earlier. Webinars like this and virtual meetings, albeit that Julia might have a diary full of them, may be a way of reducing our need for transport.
Absolutely.
For the next section, I'm going to talk a little bit about decarbonising electricity, and then I'm going to move on to talk about hydrogen as one example of a whole new industry that we need to build over the next 30 years if we're going to reach net zero. So starting with electricity, if I can have the slide, thank you. When we talk about decarbonisation, usually the first thing that springs to mind is decarbonising electricity. Renewable generation is very visible. Wind turbines are the poster child for the energy transition. And in many ways, electricity is the easiest place to start. Power is generated by big companies remote from where customers are, so they can change the nature of the generation with very little impact on the customers, apart perhaps from the bill. And that makes it good for governments to start with electricity as well. But there are other reasons for starting with electricity, and Julia mentioned some of them earlier. When you decarbonise the power system, you can then use that power system to move away from fossil fuelled heat and transport. And so that's been a recommendation of the CCC all along, that power should go first. So we're going to ask you to answer another poll now. As a knowledgeable audience, when do you believe it's realistic to expect Britain's power system to reach net zero? And while you're thinking about that poll, I'll carry on. We've had plenty of policy aimed at the electricity industry in recent years. In 2014, we had EMR, which introduced contracts for difference and a capacity market. And those were meant to drive investment as part of this energy transition. And we're going to need more policy and more engagement from government in that industry as we continue our way down to net zero. But in many ways, electricity policy is less significant than what we decide to do with heat and transport. And as Julia mentioned, the choices we make there are the difference between having to double the size of our electricity system or treble or even quadruple it. But even when there are strong drivers for change like that, it still takes time to deliver. I first got involved in the offshore wind industry in 2003. and that was nearly 2 decades ago. It took quite a long time before we even built our first offshore substation and wind farm. It took a lot of people's efforts and a long time to get that industry established. In fact, the industry nearly died in 2012. But now, nearly 20 years later, we have 12 gigawatts of offshore wind either installed or under construction, and plans for 40 by 2030. So what we can take from that is that once you get an industry going, it can start to deliver fast and things can change quickly. And the best illustration I have for that is what's happened to coal in the UK over the last few years. Back in 2012, 45% of our electricity in Britain came from burning coal. And last year that was down to less than 2%. We had the first day with no coal generation at all in 2017, and last year we had 150 days. And you might have seen in the press that we've just had 67 days in a row during lockdown with no coal generation. So once you get up to scale, industries can deliver, but it can take a long time to get there. So we've come halfway with power now, but we've done the easy part. What's left to do with power, the small matter of a lot more renewable energy, and also to make the system work, we need to find a new way of integrating that renewable energy. The reason we've been able to run on a lot of wind and solar this spring has been because we were able to burn natural gas in gas-fired power stations to keep the system going. We're going to have to do away with natural gas, and that means finding an alternative fuel for gas turbines or creating a large amount of storage, and probably both. And that brings me on to hydrogen. Hydrogen is the example of a whole new industry. Its role, it has many roles in decarbonisation. It replaces fossil fuels in many different roles. For example, we might switch from diesel trains to hydrogen trains, or we can use large amounts of hydrogen instead of large piles of coal at power stations. And as we've heard, we can use hydrogen to store offshore wind energy for days when the wind is not blowing. There are two ways to make hydrogen. The first is from electrolysis, from water with electrolysis, and we call that colloquially green hydrogen. And the second is to make it from fossil fuels via reformation with carbon capture, and we call that blue. But both green and blue hydrogen end up with hydrogen. They're both low carbon hydrogen. They're just delivered by very different industries. And we're going to need both of them. We're going to need a lot of both of them. Government modelling suggests somewhere between 200 and 300 terawatt hours of hydrogen each year by 2050. And that means a few hundred gigawatts of hydrogen production. It's going to take us about 30 years to have built 40 gigawatts of offshore wind. And in the next 30 years, we need to build a hydrogen industry that's not just as big as the wind industry is growing, but actually as big as the whole of the electricity industry is today. So how does an industry grow to that sort of size from a standing start in 30 years? I'll try and explain it with this illustration. So if we want to be at hundreds of gigawatts of production capacity by 2050, it's worth thinking about how do we get to the first gigawatt, and when does that happen? Well, blue hydrogen happens in big projects. If you're going to build an autothermal reformer with carbon capture, you need to build a carbon store in the North Sea. So that's a multi-billion-pound investment decision, and it all arrives at once. It's part of the government's plans for decarbonising the industrial clusters in Britain, and the expectation is that the first of those clusters will come on stream in the second half of this decade. So around about 2027, we should get our first large-scale blue hydrogen, and hopefully the second cluster around 2030. So by about 2030, we start to get to gigawatt scale, and somewhere in there we start running power stations on 100% hydrogen as well. Now, if we want to get to gigawatt scale with electrolyzers, green hydrogen, we're going to need a lot of clean electricity. And the good news is that the UK has a large potential source of offshore wind. And we've already seen that we are now at gigawatt scale with wind. So to get there with wind to hydrogen, we just need to ramp up the electrolyzer production. And that's about a whole supply chain that needs to build during the next decade. Today we have a small number of hydrogen fueling stations for cars and buses. We're going to need a lot more of those over the coming years. We're going to look at hydrogen trains, small industrials, ships. Eventually we're going to start putting up to 20% hydrogen blended with natural gas in the gas network, because we don't need to change anybody's appliances to do that. And then by the middle of the decade, we should be putting 100% hydrogen into parts of the network. And all of that is required so that we can ramp up an industry that will one day be capable of delivering gigawatt scale wind to hydrogen. So we need to start with small electrolyzer projects this year to get to bigger ones in a couple of years' time to one day be doing gigawatt scale. Can we go any faster? Well, if you look at the blue hydrogen, I've said it won't come online until 2027. It's going to take about 4 years to build that infrastructure, which means investment decisions need to be made in 2023. And that means that before that, somebody needs to do the FEED studies and raise the finance, and the government needs to introduce the right incentives to make that market viable. So even 2027 is quite a challenge, and we need to start with some of the policy changes and some of the FEED studies right now. And it's similar for electrolyzers. If people are going to build gigawatt scale electrolyzer factories that are available by the end of the decade, they're going to need to take investment decisions before the middle of the decade, and that means we need to build a pipeline of work and start developing the skills that we need for that industry already. And I think it's clear, I'll just build to the end of the slide. You can see that alongside all of that effort, we're going to need the right combinations of policy and market changes and enabling things like product standards to make that industry happen. So if we want hydrogen to help deliver net zero in 2050, we need to start right now. 2021 is going to be too late. If you had some marvelous industry that doubled in size every year, if you start 1 year too late, you're only halfway there when you should have finished. And so it's really important, if we want to achieve scale in the 2030s, 40s, and by 2050, we need to start these things now. So hydrogen is just one example of the speed and scale that we need to work with. We also need to do electric vehicles and hydrogen vehicles and heat pumps and district heating and hydrogen in gas grids and lots more offshore wind and green and blue hydrogen, all at giga scale and as fast as we can. It took a decade or so to do the easy half of electricity. We don't have any time to waste if we're going to deliver net zero. Now, looking at the results of the poll, let's see. I think most of you are voting for we can decarbonise electricity by around 2040, and a slightly smaller number are more optimistic by 2035. And 2035 is the kind of target that the Committee on Climate Change believe to be important if we're going to meet net zero in a cost-effective way. So I'd like to go back to the panel now that we've all spoken, just to get your take on anything that's struck you. So if I can start with Julia, do you think our audience are right? Can we decarbonise electricity somewhere between 2035 and 2040? And was there anything in particular in anything that someone has said that caught your attention?
Well, we certainly need to decarbonise most of electricity by the 2030s. I think there will be, there may well be a small amount of the power system for emergencies and peak dropping that takes right to the 2050s. But I think the majority of it, I think, sits round about 2035 is, and we can do that. I mean, I think we've demonstrated that we can do that. So and I think people have hit upon what I would see all the really critical points. I mean, I think actually we do know how to decarbonise transport. It's there are challenges, but we know how to do it. I think the points that we were hearing about, though, about decarbonising our homes, I think that's really probably is the most challenging area, because actually it needs it's the most disruptive thing for people. Getting used to a car that has slightly different characteristics. Well, actually, I mean, I've recently bought an electric car, and it does have different characteristics. You do have to get used to planning your journeys a bit differently, but actually that's not too much of a hassle. At the moment we're in the stage of we have a house with 2 boilers for various bizarre reasons. One of our boilers has gone, and we're in that position. Fortunately, it's the one that covers the guest room at the end, and we are thinking, well, this is the time we must go for a heat pump. We've just discovered we have to get planning permission. We've had two different plumbers come and tell us how difficult it would be, so we're trying to find one who's going to come and tell us how easy it will be, and we're kind of looking at the price and going, whoo. So we've got to get over that. This has got to become, this is going to be the most difficult bit, because if somebody passionate about it like me and my husband are looking at this and thinking, wow. Well, I should say we already have a solid wall insulated house. If we're thinking, wow, this is going to be disruptive and complicated, for most people they're going to walk away from it. So we've got to get this transformation, as I think was highlighted in how easy it is for you to make these decisions. And actually that point about getting people to think about planning so that when their boiler does go, they're ready to take this step. And what boilers last, I mean, our boiler's 17 years old, the one that's just gone. So we've actually only got, a 1 boiler replacement cycle, if you like, in order to get the low carbon heat into all of these buildings. So that really, for me, is one of the biggest, or probably the biggest challenge, actually.
So there's a whole ecosystem of tradespeople and specialists that we need to have as well.
We need to be on board so that they say this can be done, not that they'd say they suck and say, oh, well, you'll have to have all these things changed.
Charlotte, that's obviously something you grapple with, but was there anything in what the others said that particularly caught your attention today?
I think it was something you said, actually. The fact that we're going to have to be making investment decisions in the mid-2020s. I think, part of some of the criticism that industry has at the moment of some of the funding streams that are available from government is that they don't have this sort of long time horizon that's enabling them to be factored into investment decisions. Because I think, for some of the infrastructure that's going in now, think about a heat network, for example, that can have a 50-year lifetime for the pipe infrastructure, but there is currently no sort of ongoing tariff-based, rules-based support scheme for heat networks, although we do have things like the Heat Networks investment project that is providing capital grant and loan funding. But in terms of that sort of ongoing visibility of funding support, we don't have that at the moment. You've got the proposed closure of the domestic RHI in 1 year and the non-domestic RHI closing really soon, 2021, and that is presenting this really big funding gap for low carbon heat. And there's a big question about sort of what the shape of funding is going to look like into the future. And there are investment decisions that are being taken today even. The planning that goes behind an investment decision can take sort of 3-4 years in even installing, a heat network or even a large scale industrial heat pump. So in fact, decisions are being taken today that are going to actually not take shape until 2024, say, and we need that visibility of those investment opportunities, that support from government, and currently we just don't really have that. Although of course we do have the current consultations out about the green gas support scheme, the clean heat grant, for example. But for some technologies, particularly large scale industrial heat pumps, we still don't have that clarity going forward.
Thank you. I can see there are a lot of questions from the audience. So just quickly, Graeme, is there something that struck you? And then we'll get some questions.
Well, a couple of ones from some of the responses, right? So often people think with heat pumps that they only work in a really modern sealed box. This is a 600-year-old house that has been heated over the last 7 years by ground source heat pumps. I'm warm, I'm dry. Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, there are too many people with too many myths. I also think the education piece, a lot of people do not understand even where the heat comes from. You know, the house is either warm or it's not. They've got hot water or it's not. They don't actually care about how it arrives there. So I think there's a huge opportunity here for actually sort of business model innovation to help navigate that. You know, if you said to somebody, you get a gas bill and you have to worry about a boiler and what have you, well, if that was just, well, I'm prepared to pay X pounds per month for comfort, someone else can worry about the technology choices. So I think there needs to be a sort of a shift on education, or if education's not going to get there, business models to actually allow those who do worry about this stuff to try and help it. The other one I'd say is, you know, the anticipatory investment's really key. Making least regrets decisions. So Julia's comment about the grid needs to be bigger. Yes, but are you going to wait for the grid to get bigger and it's the start point? Or does the grid get bigger by other people doing stuff and driving that? You know, we need to have a really, really grown-up discussion collectively across all these sectors about what is the perfect, and generally the perfect's the enemy of the good. So you know, Julia's comment for me really rang true, that we need to get on with the foundations, right? And we'll worry about the roof when we get nearer the top.
Thank you. Well, there are lots of audience questions, so can I invite Judith Patton to rejoin us and pass some of those questions on to the panel?
Indeed, Matthew. What a fascinating discussion. Lovely to be sitting in the background, just soaking it up and wondering where to start with these intriguing questions. Let's just, with a massive transition to electric vehicles and renewable energy, including solar, globally, what is the panel's view on the implication of finite mineral resources such as lithium and cobalt in delivering this? That is.
Can I dive into that one?
Surely. Yeah.
So I actually listened in on a panel yesterday to a gentleman called Dr. Ewan McTurk. Okay, and he was actually showing the growth in lithium, but also that Glencore, one of the largest mining companies in the world, has actually now closed one of its largest lithium mines because there's just not enough demand to keep it open. So I think, like a lot of these things, you know, there are lots of urban myths. There are lots of, you know, grid can't cope. There aren't enough minerals. There's not enough copper. There's not enough cobalt. What I would say is engage with experts in each of those fields and let us understand the truth, not the headline grabbing articles we see in the media.
Julia had her hand up.
Yes, please. I agree with Graeme, but I would also like to say that we have got to get more into the circular economy way of thinking about these things, and we have got to get much more focus on the reuse and the recycling, and you know, things like your mobile phone. If you had, you know, we extract some of these things from incredibly from ores where there is incredibly little of what we want to get out of them. And actually, if you grind up a pile of mobile phones, you have a much richer ore for many of these key elements than people are actually, you know, have incredible processes for the stuff they dig up. So, you know, when are we going to get much stronger focus on ideally the reuse, but if we can't do the reuse, the recycling of these things, so we aren't continually digging up the planet to find more?
2%, just a quick one. My stat from the thing I was listening to yesterday, only 2% of batteries are recycled now. Think about all those old laptops and mobile phones in your drawers. So Julia, absolutely on the money for this.
It's shocking,
only
isn't it?
2% of batteries are recycled. It's shameful. But what a great business opportunity.
Yeah, we've got to shake up the world, really, haven't we? We're clear on targets for offshore wind this decade, 30 to 40 gigawatts by 2030, but less clear, nothing written in policy, in terms of written policy, national strategy for either CCS and hydrogen production? Can the Committee on Climate Change pressure governments to set explicit targets and also encourage government to set up sector deals? Aha, this sounds like you very much, Julia, to make achieving these targets happen.
Well, not with my Committee on Climate Change hat on, but actually with my offshore wind sector deal hat on.
That's what I was thinking.
I have been lobbying the government for a hydrogen sector deal. I mean, I think that's exactly what we need, because I think we have a phenomenal collection of both companies, and some of them very innovative companies with a lot of intellectual property at both the supply and the demand side. And the challenge with hydrogen is it's the chicken and the egg. You've got to develop supply and demand together, which is why I think it really does need government intervention. And I think that Matthew, I think, highlighted where we can start generating that supply and demand. We can start producing hydrogen from offshore wind today without creating any extra CO2 emissions, and we can be using it in transport, in heavy transport particularly. We've got 3 bus manufacturers in the UK, one of them in Northern Ireland, Wright Bus in Northern Ireland, who would be delighted to be expanding their factories to produce clean buses for the UK. I mean, what a great way to actually get the market going with UK technology and creating UK jobs, just the kind of thing we need for the COVID-19 recovery. So I'm not sure about absolutely precise targets at this stage, because I think that's a bit like saying we know what the roof looks like. And I think we're going to need hydrogen, and we're going to need electricity, and we're going to need green hydrogen and blue hydrogen. So it's a bit difficult at this point to say exactly how much we need of all of them, but we definitely know we need them. So getting them started at scale is absolutely no-brainer.
Thank you.
Can I just add to that?
Of course.
I think government has a hard time. It's got to do lots of things in parallel. But let's look at something that government has done well with energy, and that is getting the coal switched off. And the things that drove that were having a combination of factors. So we had the really long-term target of we are going to get to, well, when it started, 80% reduction, but now net zero. So you need that kind of long-term sense of direction. But we also had an interim target, which was we will get all coal off by 2025. And then we had market measures that started to push the old incumbent coal off through carbon pricing and bring forward the cleaner replacements through market mechanisms for other things. And it's when you have the combination of all of those things that policy starts to bite and people can really invest. But the importance of the long-term target is really key, and the importance of something that's about a decade away and really shows that the world will be very different. That can be compelling for boards of directors. So, you know, if we were to announce a date, you know, we've got a date for no more internal combustion engine cars. We've got a date for no more gas boilers in homes. We need to stick some of these intermediate milestones out there so that no one can believe that they can carry on doing what they were doing forever. And that's the first step to then taking the decision to do something different.
Yes, dates are important. Times, dates, although I don't know about all of you, but right at this moment, I'm hard pressed to work out which month we're in, let alone what the year is. You know, it comes as a surprise when you suddenly see something dated June and you think, crikey, June. And then you think, no, you silly woman, we're in June now. Anyway, no more of my brain failures. Throughout the record period, you've just mentioned coal, so let's go with coal stuff. Throughout the record period recently of not using any coal in the UK, in reality, the UK has imported about 10% of its electricity from Europe, much of which was produced by coal. In the transition to net zero for the UK, does the UK need to take responsibility of imported sources too? Any volunteers?
Shall I go for that?
Yes, please, and then Julia after you.
Yeah. Well, it's just an example of this is an interconnected world, and we need to decarbonize the planet. There is a lot to be said as a country for trying to lead other places, because it encourages other countries to do things, and also it's an opportunity to develop a supply chain and get some of the industrial benefits in your own country. So we should be leading. You can actually see what's happening across Europe real time in terms of carbon intensity, and it's often quite a mixed picture. I quite often have a look at it to see whether the UK is beating Germany or Denmark, or vice versa. And the French sit there quite smug, having had over 70% nuclear power for a long time. So even though we import over interconnectors, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's all dirty brown coal from Germany or Poland. Julia.
And I would just add that, I mean, it really does emphasize the importance of the COP. I think it also emphasizes the importance of having climate as part of our trade deals. I mean, I know we're disagreeing with the EU about that at the moment, but actually both of us have climate targets in our version of the trade deal we like, so we both accept that. But I think as we work with trade deals with the rest of the world, I think, you know, using trade deals to try and encourage the rest of the world to be on the decarbonisation path is key. But something that we're going to do on the Committee on Climate Change is also focus much more on what we call our consumption emissions. So the COP process and our commitments to reduce emissions all work on production emissions, so only the emissions that we generate in the UK, not anything we import, like imported electricity. But as we get towards net zero, it becomes much, much more important. We start to focus on the emissions that we're importing. So we're going to start increasing our reporting on consumption emissions to try and get that very much in focus.
That's really interesting. Now, there was mention of nuclear, so let's dive in on this one. Hinkley Point C and Sizewell C nuclear power plants will generate 16% of current UK electricity demand. It appears that Rolls-Royce Consortium will add 16 of their 440 megawatt. What does NPPS stand for? My mind's gone blank. Anyway, adding another 17.5%. So that adds up to 1/3 of current UK demand. Does this affect the CCC's recommendations?
Our recommendation, no, it doesn't. Won't affect our recommendations. I mean, we tend to quite like to have a little bit of nuclear on the system, because we think some baseload type capacity is helpful to balancing. But actually, as Graeme has pointed out to us, we've coped with far more and more renewables on the grid over the years, far more than we thought we were going to be able to cope with. And in general, our predictions for our scenarios, we try and stick to something close to the least cost path. And as the cost of renewables has come down so dramatically, we are, of course, envisaging some of our scenarios have some very, very high renewables paths. And as we haven't seen the cost of nuclear come down in anything like the same way, the amount of nuclear we anticipate has tended to dwindle. But, you know, we're certainly not against nuclear, and we have scenarios with higher nuclear and lower nuclear.
Graeme.
Hi, Judith. So, yeah, a couple of things just to throw in there. The least cost pathway bit is really, really important. But some of the difficult to do things are going to need quite a lot of energy intensity. So thinking about broader travel, if we're going to have clean aviation, then long haul is likely to be through some sort of synthetic fuel. And that needs a lot of energy in to get that distance out. So it will be more expensive, but it may well become possible. So when we look at the growth in things like small modular reactors, most people are thinking at the moment that that's just flowing into an energy system, an energy market. You could look at this and say, well, actually, why doesn't some of that be focused on making another commodity, which could be synthetic fuels? So I think it's also almost getting over our own sort of biases in this space. But it also articulates the need why we need greater flexibility. Back to the earlier comment about importing. At the moment, consumers generally just follow a pattern, right? Consumption has generally been relatively dumb, I guess, for want of a better word. We'll wake up in the morning, switch the kettle on, and we all have supper at the same time. So the generation has been going up and down to meet that demand. What's nice is there are symbiotic relationships starting to form here. So actually, with the growth in the offshore wind sector deal and the growth in offshore wind, having smart charging and smart heating will actually allow there to be an intelligence in the consumption side. So that is already starting to form. So there's a symbiotic relationship. So it's having the right upstream technology with some intelligence, some right mid-market tools to be able to flex, and then some smart consumption where there can be digital nudges, but also there can be signals as well for people to make informed decisions. Or if you don't want to make informed decisions, let some technology do it for you. I mean, for example, I've moved about 73% of my demand load to off-peak. And that's using technology available today. A mobile phone, an app, and an internet switch. And all they're doing is looking at my energy provider's API, their digital signal on energy cost, and National Grid's API on carbon intensity. So all I do is say to my devices, when the grid is cleaner than X, and when the price is lower than Y, go for it. Charge vehicles, heat home. And actually, that's starting to work now. So I fully appreciate I'm an early adopter. But this technology is here now to actually allow us to flex that system. Anyway, sorry, I'll let you carry on. Next question.
No, your passion is lovely. Matthew, you want to make a point?
Yes, and it's not specifically about nuclear. That's just one of many technologies. It's a wider point that often these things are framed as false choices, either this or that, or what should the mix be, or they're couched as there's this future silver bullet, so we don't need to do anything now. I think the lesson from all of the energy technologies that we've deployed so far and other technologies, whether it's batteries, solar, whatever else, it takes many years to get to scale. I've seen some research, I think it was from Imperial College, that showed that typically you're somewhere between 16 and 25 years to go from the laboratory to something that can be deployed at scale. So if it's not something that we're already doing, it's not going to be making a difference to 2030 or probably even 2040. And we don't have the time to hang about. And similarly, we know that we've got to decarbonize everything. When we look at heating, for example, in Charlotte's domain, it's often phrased as should we do hydrogen in the gas grid, or should we do heat networks, or should we do heat pumps? We've seen there are, 29 million buildings in the UK. Let's do 1 million of each. And when we've done 1 million of each, and we've built a supply chain for each, and the cost has started to come down, maybe then we can have a conversation about what the other 25 million, what the balance between those technologies is going to be. But we're going to need all of them.
Mm-hmm. But how do we get that million of the three variations on the theme? Who's going to determine you're part of that million?
I think the way we see it is that that's where sort of the local authority can actually start to play a role. We know that, for example, there are pilots going on where we're deploying heat pumps relatively at scale, small scale still. We're seeing heat networks deployed at scale, potentially being retrofitted across cities. And then, of course, you have got hydrogen trials taking place as well. So I think the way we see it is we need to be encouraging and allowing those local areas that are perhaps at a stage where they have a clear pathway for how they could decarbonise, have the skills and resources and the will to do it, to actually start those trials at scale. I think for us, we want to see be, zoning pilots taking place from now, because I think you're right. It's this learning by doing approach that that will enable, and it will enable us to actually try and test, what the consumer response is, what the wider system benefits could be from strategically deploying heat pumps and EVs in areas where we expect there'll be high EV deployment, so that the network reinforcement costs come down, and actually start to realize some of those wider strategic benefits, like how we invest in skills in a smart way, that then we can actually start to roll that out at scale. And I think for many local authorities and local areas that are thinking about how they, what the right mix is for them, being able to look to examples where these processes and strategies have been piloted successfully will create confidence that will then enable them to, share learnings and actually consider what the pathway is for them as well.
So, Julia.
I just think I see somebody's asking a question about stricter new build standards. Hopefully, this consultation about all new homes have to be off the gas grid by 2025 actually will drive the opportunity to try out some of these other technologies, some of the district heating solutions, some of the heat pump solutions, because actually in areas like between Cambridge and Oxford, we have an arc where there's going to be an enormous amount of new building over the next 10 years or so. So we really do need to make sure we get these, we get up to scale, and the learning by doing and the cost reduction in these ways.
Yes, because you're going to have a new town between those, aren't you? Between Oxford and Cambridge.
There's a great arc of development with yes, hundreds of thousands of new homes planned in yes.
Can I ask a very general question? We've got 550 people sitting in the audience. What can they do to make a difference? Who'd like to attack that one first?
Go on, I'll have a go.
Good old you, Graeme. Go for it.
So everybody's situation is different, either affordability, the home they're in.
Yeah.
Just ask intelligent questions. Instead of just saying, I do what I do today, how can I do it differently? So am I spending a lot on my energy bill? So where am I wasting that energy? Is it poorly insulation? Can I look at doing that and doing something about that? Do I have to jump in the car and drive somewhere? Could I get on a bike? I think if we ask ourselves those little challenging questions, if everybody starts doing a little bit, the cumulative impact is huge. I didn't know anything about heat pumps and electric cars, right? I've had to educate myself, but it's just by asking almost the dumb question. Explain it to me like an idiot so I get it. And then once you get it, you can actually then talk to people about your experience. I mean, I use a real world example. Nobody knew they needed a smartphone before somebody showed. I mean, if you think about how you came into having a smartphone, somebody showed you theirs and you thought, well, that's really cool, I want one. So if we can start asking our own questions, try and make our own changes, and then let everybody know what our experiences is, good or bad, then I think people will learn by doing, learn by sharing. But I think this has to be something we take on personally. Don't wait for government to mandate I do something. Ask my own questions.
What actually got you going?
Fear. So it literally really was. So I bought this house derelict 9 years ago, and I bought a caravan on eBay. I'd watched one too many Grand Designs, and so I'm living in a caravan, and I asked a really clever guy to do an energy survey. So this was after I bought the house, and it had a bit of oil and a bit of electricity heating and some gas heaters. So it wasn't a solution. And he did all these energy calculations. He said, well, I've got some good news for you. You can heat your house. Fantastic. What's the answer? He said, well, it's oil. I'm not really sure I would like the answer. And he said, it's going to cost you £5,000 to £5,500 in oil to heat your home every year. And I realized that was not affordable. But also it told me that I was going to have a transit van or size oil tank in my garden. I didn't like the sound of that either. So really it was the fear of what I was going to have to do and then be stuck with just prompted me to ask questions. What are the other choices? What do they mean? So actually that led me down the route of organisations like the Energy Saving Trust. They were brilliant, stepping me through the choices. Asking people, going to exhibitions, seeing others who've done it. So I'm one of the first 500 renewable heat incentive participants, and I must say, absolutely brilliant. You know, the next evolution though is what do we learn in smart charging cars to running smart heating? Because actually, I've got water tanks here. They're the biggest and cheapest battery you'll find. That adds system flexibility. So I think it is a case of sometimes fear is our biggest enemy. Just we need to be brave. We need to try things, and we need to then share what that experience was like.
Right, right. We've got a question actually that ends up with how can the heat pump sector get their message across? Nothing more daft than starting with the end of a question, Judith. The fact that 40% of those responding to the poll consider insulation disruption to be a barrier to heat pump deployment suggests that there are significant misunderstandings around the relationship between heat pumps and heat loss. Heat pumps are being successfully deployed in very leaky listed buildings. Insulation levels are not a barrier. A fabric-first approach is essential, regardless of heating technology. So then the question, how can the heat pump sector get this message across? And indeed, many of the messages that you've been giving this morning, yes, I knew your hand would go up, Charlotte.
Indeed. So I think whoever's asked this question is quite right. A fabric-first approach is crucial across any heat decarbonisation solution that you are looking to put into your home or building. And I think for us, one of the key messages that we'd like to see coming from government as they look to begin consumer engagement and awareness raising campaigns about our domestic route to net zero is the fact that there will be no low carbon heating solutions that do not require some level of in-home disruption. And I think that includes hydrogen. And I think, you know, that's a narrative that's quite useful when you're talking about hydrogen, is to be able to say it's really low impact in consumer homes because you can just, you know, make a small change to your boiler, swap out your boiler. But actually, even when we're installing hydrogen, we still need to see those levels of energy efficiency going up, because ultimately by improving our energy efficiency, we're reducing the scale of the challenge. Yeah. And I think this question from this this questioner is not really just about what the heat pump industry can do to sort of improve the conversation around energy efficiency levels. It's what can we do as a sector to be pushing the need for energy efficiency improvements, because I think right across the sector, we will need to see higher levels of fabric energy efficiency. So I think to answer the question, I think really what the heat pump sector can be doing and what the broader energy sector can be doing is actually starting to consider energy efficiency alongside every single decision that we make. You know, every single funding decision needs to think about, you know, what is the contribution that this is making to a broader, wider energy system? Is this actually helping to make the system more smart and more efficient? And ultimately, is it helping to reduce costs right across the system? And energy efficiency is one way that we can do that, including when you're installing a heat pump. And I think really at the moment, the issue for I think where we see this conversation about energy efficiency linked with heat pumps is mostly coming from a concern about vulnerable people and people in fuel poverty. We do see instances where heat pumps are deployed in low efficiency buildings, and they can create very high running costs. So I think it's just about finding the correct balance between doing as much as we can to improve our energy efficiency while supporting those who are in fuel poverty to ensure that they still have warm homes and are getting low carbon heat for a fair price.
Yes, we mustn't forget those people. It's all very well for Graeme to leap in because of fear, but there are people who just can't afford to do anything at all. And that is a terrible state of affairs. I think probably one last one before I hand back to Matthew. What is the long-term strategy for the national grid with regards to decarbonisation? Lots of initiatives on community energy provision, but do you desire a smaller grid or a grid less dependent by households, industry?
Well, that's a really good one. So again, this comes back to that sort of tribal commentary. You know, some people are into this space where it's electricity or hydrogen. There are those who are in the decentralized energy space, which means we don't need the grid. we're going to do everything local, you know. No, both of those are right. If you follow the Committee on Climate Change and our net zero pathway, we're going to need big offshore wind. That only gets there by the nature of a big transmission grid. So I guess the thing is, when you start to talk about decentralized energy, they say, yes, we can do this decentralized, but we know the grid's there to catch us if we fall. So it's a case of what you actually need to do is agree that both of those things are right. We will have more decentralized energy. We will have more democratized energy. People will be able to participate in the energy system, making their own, making value choices. So we must encourage that. But do we see a world where there's no grid or there's all grid? No, it's a blend of everything. And this is where I think the maturity of discussion, which is nice obviously amongst well-informed people around us, is this needs to stop being tribal. It's not I'm right for you to be wrong. It's not one or another. The answer is we need to do everything, and that includes energy infrastructure and networks.
Do you know?
I hope to answer the question that helps.
Yeah, do you know, at the very first All Energy, we had a speaker who said what you need is a basket of energy, which went against the audience view at that point, and he was almost booed off the stage because we were a renewable show. But my God, we do indeed need that basket, don't we?
We certainly do.
Right, Matthew, I think you want it back round about this second.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to pick up on the question, what can the audience do? And I'm making the assumption that a lot of people in the audience are either professionally interested or personally interested in energy and how we decarbonise. And I think something we can all do is talk about it in a positive way. Often these things are phrased as a climate calamity that we have to, we have to do something. If we can reframe the way we talk about putting it in the context of building a better world, who's not going to argue for a cleaner, safer, better world? So I think there's something about taking the positive view. And an example I would give is from my own company and people who work within it. A lot of people at Siemens work in the oil and gas business. And if you're in the oil and gas business, if you think of what you're doing as we're in the burning fossil fuels business, the idea of acting on climate change becomes a real problem for you. Whereas if you recognize that actually you're in the bringing energy to people business, oil and gas is just one way of doing that. And it allows you then to reframe your thinking and think, well, I can be in the oil and gas business and part of my job is to help stop using fossil fuels. And you can do that by doing carbon capture and making hydrogen. You can do that by improving the efficiency with which we get the fossil fuels, and you can do it by encouraging all of the other renewable energies. So there's something about talking to people about the positives and picking up on the other point that the energy transition will be local. We've talked about speed and scale. The best way to get to scale is not to do a small number of big projects, it's to do a huge number of small things, and small things can happen locally. So if there's something that you can do in your business or in your home or with your local area, crack on and do it. And those build to something much bigger. So we just have a few minutes left, so perhaps we can just go round the panel and thank you, Judith, and thank you, the audience, for questions. Is there any last takeaway that anyone in the panel would like to share before we finish? Julia.
I think we really do need for our government to turn the crisis that we're currently experiencing with the pandemic into an opportunity. There's going to need to be an enormous amount of investment to support industry. There's going to be an enormous amount of retraining for people who sadly will have lost their jobs because of the COVID-19 crisis. This is the opportunity to make some of these things happen. This is the opportunity to make that a green investment and a green recovery, and to put in place a national investment bank to help support, to help draw other investment in to get these projects off the ground and running. So, a brave government can turn this crisis into an opportunity. And if we turn it into a green opportunity, it will be a better future for all of us.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yep.
Charlotte.
Yeah, I think I would just echo Julia's point there, and actually a quick plug for the Heat Networks Industry Council, which launched just a couple of weeks back. They have committed to up to 35,000 new jobs for the heat network sector, and I think that's a brilliant opportunity post-COVID to be promoting the growth of the heat network sector and the low carbon heat sector, because we are a sector that can deliver new jobs for the British public, and I think my one sort of takeaway and comment and thing that I would ask of the audience is to really start having a serious conversation about retrofit. Some of the solutions around new build are far more simple when you compare them with retrofit, and actually retrofit, this retro gap, is the real challenge that we need to be addressing. There are 29 million homes that need to reach net zero, and we need to start thinking about what the pathways are for existing buildings to reach net zero.
Thank you. Graeme?
Yeah, a couple of things, literally through the transport lens. I am really encouraged. I've been in the energy industry for 20 years. I've never seen more joined up government than I have now. And I know that seems strange to those of us who sort of engage with government sometimes, but there are a few things that are coming that help with some signposting. So on the 6th of July, I think Treasury will be publishing their National Infrastructure Plan. So that's the big infrastructure projects we're going to need. So it'll be interesting to see kind of the narrative in there, and a lot of that was informed by the CCC and the National Infrastructure Commission. We've also seen OLEV have done a great piece of work around Project Rapid. How do we overcome the barriers of long distance travel and high power charging? So that's out already, and they're working on how to deploy 500 million of new money to do the underlying infrastructure for that. But also finally, Department of Transport are working behind the scenes now and engaging with lots of stakeholders, because by the time we get to the end of the year, they're going to publish their Decarbonisation of Transport Plan, and that covers road, rail, aviation, maritime, walking, cycling, the whole lot. So within a very short period of time, between now and the end of the year, there are a number of things and signposts for those in the market to see where government's thinking is coming. And finally, that all then builds into the Build Back Better. Julia's comment about, recovery. Retraining people, getting people into jobs that help us on this journey will be really key.
And Judith, you wanted to say something?
Yes, you mentioned local. Can I remind the audience that this afternoon, well, at 12:30, there is a community and local energy webinar, which we very much welcome you to.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody. It's all we have time for today, but you can continue the discussion using various hashtags. So there are two hashtags, all energy webinars or decarbonise webinars, all one word, both of those, or you can use the hashtag speed and scale, all one word and there's a word in the middle. I look forward to getting some feedback for all of us in the panel on Twitter immediately after this with that hashtag. Before we go, I just want to say we've only got less than 1 billion seconds to get to net zero, so we'd better crack on and do it. And I'd like you all remotely to thank our wonderful panel today: Charlotte Owen, Graeme Cooper, Julia King, and surrogate member Judith Patton. I'm Matthew Knight. Thank you for taking part. Stay safe wherever you're locked down, and I hope to see you in person at a future All Energy somewhere beyond COVID-19. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.